Blanks make me feel like I'm like in Hollywood or something, like getting ready to appear in my first movie.
Man, no pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. Be one of those terrible Hallmark movies, you know. All right, ready when you are?
Anytime.
All right. Well, welcome to the very first day of our intensive. We're going to begin today with a devotion, as we will all 5 days of this week. Go ahead and turn with me in your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 7, and we'll read an epic text from the Old Testament, a text that I think is going to be especially helpful for us as we travel through this class together. 1 Samuel chapter 17, beginning in verse 1. I'll give you a minute to turn there. It's a story I'm sure all of you are familiar with. I'll bet some of you have actually preached or taught on this passage. It's a story of David and Goliath, an epic battle, single combat between David and the giant Goliath. So chapter 17, verse 1 reads, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Sukkah, which belongs to Judah, and they camped between Sukkah and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and camped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array to encounter the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, while Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. Then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits in a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was clothed with scale armor, which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. He also had bronze greaves on his legs, and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. His shield carrier also walked before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel and said to them, 'Why do you come out to draw up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and you servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will become your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall become our servants and serve us.' Again the Philistine said, 'I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together.' When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid." Now you all know this story. The champion who's going to rise up for the Israelites is going to be a little boy named David. And if we skip forward a little bit to verse 32, we'll find David speaking to King Saul. In verse 32, we read, "David said to Saul, 'Let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine.' Then Saul said to David, 'You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, while he has been a warrior from his youth.' But David said to Saul, 'Your servant was tending his father's sheep when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock. I went out after him and attacked him and rescued it from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God.' And David said, 'The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine.' And Saul said to David, 'Go, and may the Lord be with you.'" I read that passage yesterday as I was preparing for this class, and I heard those words to me, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Taking a class on classic epic literature and teaching a class on classic epic literature is a bit like confronting a giant. It's a bit like being David facing this giant who's much larger than us. Let's pray that God will be with us and that we will be able to accomplish this task. Our Father, we come to you this morning. We come from different places, from different battles we've been fighting. Perhaps it was just getting through the weekend with family responsibilities. Perhaps it was services that we were leading yesterday in church. We ask you, Father, that you would be with us during this week, that you would guide our conversations, that you would guide the teacher to be interesting, to not be boring on this topic, that you would guide the students to diligence in this very exciting and yet sometimes difficult topic of epic literature. We ask you, Father, most of all, that in this class, that in our time together, that we would learn more about you and that we would grow in our relationship with Christ. We ask you all these things for Jesus' sake. Amen. Well, I'm going to open our class with an introduction to myself. I'll tell you a little bit about me, and then I'll give you a chance to, each of you, tell me a little bit about yourselves. You can see I'm sweating a little bit because I'm actually not used to these lights, so I'm going to have to take a break before too long and wipe some of this sweat off my face. But I'm going to put up on the screen this insignia. Does anybody recognize this? They're ostrich feathers. I spent 3 years living in the UK with my family. I was getting a PhD in church history. I'll tell you a little bit about it. But what you see here are 3 ostrich feathers and the German words Ich dein. Anybody know what those are? It's the insignia of the Prince of Wales in the UK. He has worn this insignia for more than 6 centuries. The story is that in the middle of the 1300s, the English were doing something the English loved to do, which is they were fighting the French. If you've spent any time in the UK, you'll know that to this day the English have a kind of condescending attitude towards the French, especially when it comes to the French military abilities. This was during the middle of a war called the 100 Years' War. And this motto was actually the motto of one of the French soldiers, a man who was fighting for the French in the 100 Years' War, a man named John of Bohemia. John of Bohemia led part of the French army against the English. And at one of the key battles, called the Battle of Crécy in 1346, the French did what the French always do in battle. They showed up a little bit late. And by the time they were there, the English had already gotten the high ground and had positioned their archers in an impregnable position. And the English did what they always do, which is mowed down the French. The French charged blindly into the English lines, and the English mowed them down with their arrows. This is, if you talk to your typical English person, they'll tell you this is how battles between the English and the French were always fought. The King of Bohemia had this motto, Ich dein, means I serve. And the King of Bohemia was watching the battle from the sidelines and realizing that the French soldiers were being mowed down by arrows. And he thought, this isn't right. I'm one of the leaders. I should go into battle too. I'll just toggle it here so you can keep seeing it. So he decided to go into battle. The only problem was he was blind. He had been blind for about 10 years. So he had his camp attendants tie their horses to either side of him and point him in the direction of the English line, and he charged blindly at the English and was mowed down and killed. The English recovered his body, they recovered his insignia, and they were so impressed with the way he had died that the Prince of Wales, ever since, has used this insignia and this motto as his own. Ich dein, I serve. Now, I feel a little bit like the King of Bohemia. That's why I'm telling you this story. To teach classic epic literature is a bit like charging into battle. The English love these kind of stories because the King of Bohemia, as they would say, put on a good show. He was going to die anyway, but he died bravely at the hands of the English. I feel like a little bit like that, tackling classic epic literature, because the subject is so broad and so wide a topic that it's really, really hard to attack it well. But we'll try. And hopefully together, we'll get through the next 5 days. You will hopefully come out of this class with a greater sense of appreciation for classic epic texts. Hopefully, you will still be alive. You won't be like the King of Bohemia, hopefully. You won't have been killed by the English or the epic arrows. And hopefully, you will have a greater appreciation, not just for these texts in a vacuum, but how we as Christians can read these texts and appreciate these texts. So let me tell you a little bit about me, and then we'll take a few minutes and I'll go around and ask each of you a little bit about you. We have 2 more who are showing up live, who are going to be here, I guess, in the next 10 minutes. As I mentioned, they had some car trouble, so they'll be here in the next 10 minutes or so. And we have 1 person who's appearing remotely. And I'll tell you a little bit how we'll deal with that in a minute here. But a little bit about myself. I have been at Knox as a full-time professor for the last year. Scott and I were talking, we were students together a number of years ago, so I actually went to Knox as a student as well. My background with these kind of texts is that I grew up in a homeschool world where from the time of first grade onward, I was homeschooled by my parents. And my parents knew that the classics were important, and from my earliest memories, I was reading these texts. My mother and father initially had not read them themselves, but they knew they were important. They knew Homer mattered. And so I have very, very early memories of reading first abridged and then full versions of the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid and books like that, some of which we'll be talking about together. It really instilled in me a love for these texts and an appreciation for their importance. Hi, come on in. Welcome. We're just getting started, so you're fine. We haven't even introduced ourselves, so you're perfectly fine. I'm just starting to talk about myself, so this is a welcome introduction, or a break in that introduction. So, we'll go around in a few minutes and you guys can introduce yourselves. You doing okay?
Yeah.
Got the car fixed? Okay.
Yeah, he did it.
Good. I was just telling a little bit about my own background. So I was homeschooled, read the classics as a child, and then went off to get an education and went to the University of Florida and got a degree in economics because I thought I was going to be a businessman, a classically educated businessman. But then I realized I wasn't very good at math, and that's not very good for going into business. So I decided I would do something else, and I decided to go to law school. So I went to Stetson Law School, which is right outside of St. Petersburg, Florida, on the west coast of Florida, and got a law degree at Stetson. Still didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life, but I decided to get married. And while I was in law school, my wife and I got married. And I remember that being a really just enjoyable time, taking classes in law school and getting to know my wife, the two of us getting to know each other. But when I finished law school, I decided to try to figure out where I could actually get a job. I had gone to law school with this great ambition of being a prosecutor. I was going to stand for justice. But I didn't get one of those jobs. I got a job instead as a personal injury trial attorney. And I worked down here for a firm called Furness & Bowling for 5 years as a defense attorney representing individuals and companies, typically in personal injury claims. So I handled claims ranging from someone who said that she had a little bit of coffee spilled on her hand when she was taking her coffee from the window at Burger King. She said it had changed her life. There's no scarring. She said it changed her as a person, just the trauma of that event. I got to speak in very general terms about these things. Everything from that to personal injuries that resulted in death, so wrongful death type cases. So that whole gamut. Practicing law was good because it taught me what I didn't want to do for the rest of my life. It's a very stressful environment. But it was very good in terms of teaching me to organize my thoughts, teaching me to speak in public and those sorts of things. So I'm very grateful for that time that I spent practicing law. I practiced law in total for about 5 years. Down here, kind of got to know this area, got to know this jurisdiction. And while I was practicing law, I actually found out about Knox. My family and I, my wife and I, started coming to Coral Ridge here, and we realized that they had Sunday school classes that were actually being taught by seminary professors. I thought, man, what are the odds? That's pretty cool. So we found out a little bit more about the seminary, and I decided to come on part-time as a student, which nearly killed me. If you've ever, you guys are doing this now, so you kind of know what I'm talking about. You work full-time and then you rush here and you're taking a class, maybe your car breaks down on the way, it's stressful. So there was a period where I just about almost died trying to juggle, taking a wrongful death deposition down in Miami and then getting in my car and zooming up to Fort Lauderdale and taking an Old Testament class. It's and the two, you're just thinking, well, how do these two relate to each other? And I can't really do either very well. So I got to the point where I felt like the Lord was calling me to come on full time. It was right around the time that my wife and I found out we were expecting our first child, which was an interesting confluence of events, you know? So I literally went into my managing partner's office and told him I was leaving the practice of law to go to seminary, you know, because the money's so much better, you know, as a seminary student. You know, I told him I was going to seminary full time. I told him I developed a relationship with some professors here at Knox, and I really loved what Knox stood for, so I wanted to come on full time. You know, and of course, my managing partner said, you know, I completely understand. You know, you're young. It's a very good life decision. I'm joking. I won't repeat it word for word, but it was more disparaging than that. But one of the things that I said to the partner I was working for is I said, look, here's the thing. You know, I'm still really young, and at that point, my wife and I didn't know that we were expecting a baby. So I said, well, we don't have any kids yet. I literally walked out of his office and within a day had gotten the call from my wife, I'm pregnant. I thought, oh man, what am I doing? But the Lord was faithful to us, was very gracious to us. We ended up with our first pregnancy having some tremendous complications along the way. And so I just remember sitting in a worship class here with kind of a similar number of students, and we would go around and pray at the start of the class. And I remember individual students praying for my wife and I as we went through that. It was a really meaningful time for us. My wife and I now have 2 children, so we had our first son, whose name is Andrew. We knew at the time that we wanted to go to Scotland, and the patron saint of Scotland is Andrew, so we named him Andrew. Then when I finished my time here at Knox, I got the Master's of Divinity in Theology here at Knox, and developed a relationship with a PhD supervisor in Edinburgh, Scotland, someone who had actually worked for Dr. Scotty Maynor, who teaches church history here. She had been his advisor in Scotland. So I developed a relationship with her and decided I would go get a PhD in church history. And for the last 3 years or so, I've lived in Scotland, got a PhD, which is just recently finished, in church history. I studied Augustine, and I studied legal issues surrounding a controversy called the Donatist controversy, if you've heard of the Donatists. I was interested in some of the legal arguments that Augustine made, and I was able to examine that evidence as a lawyer. So we'll see what kind of response that gets. It was examined by 2 classicists who both liked it. But then again, English scholars tend to be very polite, and it's hard to tell when they're insulting you and when they're complimenting you. The very first academic paper I gave at Oxford about 4 years ago. And I stood right in the same place where a very famous Augustine scholar named Peter Brown, you've heard of Peter Brown, wrote an Augustine biography that's wonderful. He had stood there about 50 years before and given a paper. You know, and I thought, this is incredible. I'm standing in the same place in Oxford. And my paper was not nearly as good as his. Let's just say that. His kind of set the standard for the scholarship. Mine was kind of a blip on the screen. But this woman that I ended up working with, my PhD advisor, came up to me after that and said, you know, that was very interesting. You know, and I thought, you're laughing. I thought, wow, she loved it. You know, it was interesting. I then learned that sometimes when an English or a British person tells you that's interesting, that means I'm trying to think of something to say about it, and I want to be kind. You know, I don't want to be too mean. So my experience in Scotland was wonderful. My wife and I ended up having a second child while we were living in Scotland, which was a wonderful experience. My 2 boys grew up for 3 years in Scotland, both of them developing a Scottish brogue, you know what I'm talking about, a way of speaking that's very Scottish. So my older son, Andrew, in particular, to this day, will use rather in a very British way. You know, he'll say, it's rather hot today, Daddy, that kind of thing. They use Scottish terms for certain things. You know, there isn't a stroller, it's called a buggy, if you live over there, you know. I know some of you have traveled and lived in other contexts, you know, so you know a bit what that's like adjusting to a different language. I think it was Winston Churchill who said that the UK and America are 2 countries divided by a common language. And there's a bit of that, you know, the same words don't exactly mean exactly the same things. Which you find if, for instance, you're at a dinner party and you make a statement And everyone just kind of looks at everyone else and thinks, uh-oh. And you go, oh no, that word doesn't mean what it means in the States, you know? But it was a wonderful experience. It was a time of real growth for my wife and I, and for our two boys. Our two boys now are just about 5 and just about 3. They'll both turn 5 and 3 next month, actually, so we're looking forward to that. But Scotland is just a wonderful place to live and study. Scottish people are wonderful and kind. The architecture is ancient. You know, you walk past a castle that was, you know, there since the time of the Romans in some form. You know, it's just a remarkable place to live and study. And it's a wonderful place to study the classics. So part of my time there was spent not just studying Augustine, but studying the classical context for Augustine's life and thought. I think that's enough about me. I'm going on at length. I should probably stop. What I'll just kind of tell you in conclusion, as far as the introduction to myself, is just these books are what I get out of bed in the morning for. I mean, this is what motivates me as a scholar and just as a person. So I'm hoping a little bit of that will rub off on you. If it doesn't, that's okay. That probably means you're just normal. You don't have whatever's wrong with me wrong with you. But I'm hoping a little bit of that will rub off on you. So let me kind of ask each of you, if you would, to go around and introduce yourself to the rest of us. I don't know that we all know each other yet. I don't think that we probably do. So it's a good chance for us to go around and introduce ourselves. I will wipe some of the sweat off of my brow that's gathering up. Let's start here. So obviously tell us your name, but also just tell us where you're coming from. Tell us a little bit about where you are in your program here at Knox. And then tell us, most importantly, what kind of exposure you've had to the classics, you know, great books.
How much time are you looking for? I mean, maybe
30 minutes? No,
3 minutes?
I'm just kidding. 3 minutes is great.
Okay. My name is Sam Peters, and I am going to graduate with from this degree, the MACCS, in May, but I have 2 more classes I'm going to be taking in the summer. I married my wife in 2017. I was living in Romania for a year. We got married. She moved to Romania with me, and we were evangelizing in Romania, and we found out last December that she was pregnant, and that was not planned, and we thought it'd be best if we came back to the States. Her father is in the medical field, so I knew that they would probably not support it. They were skeptical of us being there in the first place, and definitely more skeptical that she was going to be in Romania for birth, because their medical system is not that good. So May is 6.5 months, I think. She was born on August 24th. This is the first time that we've been away for a week now. I mean, we're going to be away for a week during this class, and I'm kind of scared, but we've been talking and things have been fine. Anyways, actually on the way here, we were 20 minutes away, and I heard a noise, and I used to work on cars, and I saw my battery light was on. I'm like, the serpentine belt just broke. I said, we have to get to an auto zone. So it was actually a hard change. It wasn't that hard, but it wasn't as easy as I was hoping to be. But anyways, we're here and it's great. I recently wrote my thesis with Dr. Bruce, and I did it on Augustine and Aquinas on their understanding of free will.
It was very good, by the way.
Thank you.
It's going to be the new standard on that topic.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I argued that Aquinas, which is probably controversial here, but Aquinas identified a place in Augustine that could be improved on, and I didn't really argue that Aquinas himself solved the problem of free will. Anyways, I really enjoy the classics. I still need to take, I don't even know the classes, but I know if I wasn't going to take this class, I was going to take Milton's and Dante, and then I was going to take, I forget what the next one is, and then is it
Nietzsche and Dostoevsky.
Yeah.
Thucydides and somebody else.
Is it Thucydides? Yeah. So, anyways, I'm almost done with the program. I'm hoping to. Me and my wife are saving right now for me to maybe go on and get a PhD maybe in Edinburgh.
Yeah, hopefully in Scotland.
Yeah, Aberdeen. We've talked about it some, but I'm not sure right now. Praying about it and seeing what God will do. This is my brother. You can go ahead.
That's a good segue.
Yeah,
so a little bit just about classic texts, like great books and things like that. So how much of those have you read coming into this class?
Okay, I have Plato and Aristotle and Aquinas. I've read a lot. Augustine. I'm sure there's more.
Yep.
But yeah, those
a
are
good
the
start.
ones that I've actually studied more. I mean, I really like sort of Kierkegaard. I really like G.K. Chesterton, but I'm not sure if he's classic. So.
All right.
All right, so I'm Abe. I'm his brother.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm a minister with a church in Day City, so we just drove here today from our place because he was in Mississippi. I found my wife at a college that we attended together, and she's actually from DeLand, which is right next to where Stetson.
It is, yeah, next to where the main campus is.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So I knew where that place is. Finding this program, it was like, I wanted to do something in apologetics at first, and I kept thinking, I was like, I don't want a degree in quote-unquote apologetics, because it almost seems like, well, you're just doing this just so you can, fight people or criticize people. I don't know if I want to do that. Although I do appreciate it. So I was thinking about how do you get underneath all of that. I want to know about the ideas of the history and such. And so I kept looking, and then I found this program, and I was like, whoa. So I was digging around, and there was some online classes that you could watch in the lectures. So I was listening to those. I was like, this is where I need to go. So I was still in my undergrad at that time, but then I graduated, and I still wasn't able to go for a little while. So a couple of years down the road, I ended up going, and I am, I forget exactly how far I have to go, but I've got a little bit longer. I think Sam is farther along than I am at this point, because I took some time off, and because I also have a kid. His girl was born on the 24th of August, and my son was born on the 24th of July, so they're a month apart, so they're cousins. So my son's John Ezra, so this is the first time we've been away. I've been away from him, so it's been good. As far as classics go, the readings I've had in my courses work, that's definitely probably the biggest exposure. I think I read Dante's Divine Comedy at one point beforehand. I tried to read the Iliad several times, and I just could not, and even Dante's comedy, it was so hard to read it, especially,
It's kind of intimidating just looking at it, isn't it?
Yeah, so I was like, what am I going to get out of this? And so I was really discouraged for a while. And then after this course, I got interested in more, and now since I've read it again, I really, really appreciate it. And I think that's pretty much it. But something else about both of us, we're both homeschooled as well. So.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
See, I've known both of you for a while. I didn't know you were homeschooled. Okay. Well,
yeah, and we
representing the homeschool world.
We were talking about this, and we actually did a classical school thing for a tad bit, where we learned a bunch of Latin and Greek together. But he doesn't remember it.
Or we'll call it. We'll call on you guys for all the Greek
right.
terminology.
So that's pretty much about me.
Okay.
Well, I'm Jose. I am local. I teach at a high school, Calvary Christian Academy, if you know where that is. I'm actually a film teacher, so my background is maybe a little bit different from you guys. That's a little bit intimidating, but I think I'll get through it. So yeah, I'm a film teacher. I went to Biola University, studied film. Anyone who goes to Biola gets a Bible minor. So didn't necessarily get like a Bible degree. Yeah, part of the reason I'm here is to, well, first of all, I'm a filmmaker. I love writing. I have done some projects, short films, and just constantly write stories. So to me, it was very appealing to just read literature. Honestly, like throughout high school, I got A's in every class except for English because I'm an immigrant. I came here when I was in 7th grade, and then it took me a while to learn English. I started speaking in freshman year, so not really knowing the language and then reading the Odyssey in English class was kind of interesting. But
I can believe it.
But
it's hard if English is your first language, you know.
Yeah, and then I didn't know what world I was stepping into when I first read the Odyssey, but now I've now that I speak English and now I can read the text. It's good. I love stories, and that's kind of where I come from. That's my thing. And so I think I'm coming to Knox to kind of explore that a little bit more, the intersection of story and theology, to hopefully help the school and some of my students to form some sort of integration curriculum. I mean, as far as I just started. This is like my first day of graduate school.
Well, welcome to Knox.
I think Josh sent the syllabus, and I freaked out a little bit because of the amount of reading. So
you weren't the only one.
Yeah, I was like, Josh, I don't know, man. Like, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to read everything, but hopefully I was able to get all of it done, pretty much except for East of Eden, and that took me a while because I'm a slow reader. But I enjoyed it. I think I understand way more now. So, yeah,
Good.
Super excited to be here.
Good.
My name is Scott Carson. As Josh mentioned, I've been at Knox for a very long time. I'm on the short bus, so I take a few classes here and there as I have time and opportunity. I work at a church down the road full time, and so this is as often as classes and my schedule work out, I take them. I moved here from Illinois about 9 years ago. Met my wife here. We've got 2 little boys, a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and well, you guys aren't experiencing this yet, but time change is not a great thing for home life.
No, it's not.
So that 1 hour time change is a bit of a
You guys
challenge.
picked a good time to be away.
Yeah, it's a good time to do it.
Where are you from in Illinois?
Small town called Mahomet, Illinois, but it's just outside of Champaign, Urbana, if you've heard of that.
Okay. You know where Rockford is?
Mhm.
Yeah, that's where I grew up. Yeah,
Okay.
that's where we're going. Are you
Rockford or
Rockford.
outside of Rockford?
Rockford.
Okay, we'll talk. But moved down here, met my wife, have our 2 kids, honestly, out of the church. When it comes to ethics, I'm still struggling with what the definitions of those will be, so I might have read some. But outside of this class, I really haven't read a lot of the epics, and so my first real exposure was trying to read them before this week. So I kind of jumped in the deep end.
Good. You're not alone, and hopefully even the definition of an epic will be a little bit more clear at the end of the class. Hopefully.
I think it will.
Yeah. Well, welcome.
Thanks.
All right. Last but not least.
Yeah. My name is Jim Geiger, like Geiger Counter. I admire you guys. I've got socks older than most of you. I grew up in Fort Lauderdale and felt a calling on my life even when I was a student at Fort Lauderdale High School back in the 50s. And never really could get a handle on it. I really didn't feel like that I was called to be a minister, a pastor. I went to Stetson University.
No kidding.
In
Okay.
DeLand.
Yeah.
Met my wife, and here again, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to study, but at that time they had a new program called American Studies, where you could study history and political science and economics, and in other words, instead of studying a discipline or a specific area, you studied a geographical area of American. So, but one thing about Stetson in those days, they had a G courses, they call them.
Okay.
The first 2 years was general education. So we had Western civilization and took a year of Christianity and Western thought and those kinds of courses and the G courses. That was my first exposure to Augustine.
Okay.
And those kinds of things. And I continued to feel a calling on my life, but I couldn't get a handle on it. In fact, Stetson was at that time associated with the Baptist Church. I'm a Baptist, have always been, family-wise and so forth. So anyway, they had a program, they had a ministerial scholarship, and if you were serious enough that your church would license you as a ministerial student, then you got a free ride to tuition, and of course it was a private school, and I desperately needed it, but I didn't feel like that I could take the money because I didn't feel for sure. I was equivocal about the sense of calling, and so I didn't take the money. Still didn't know what I wanted to do when I graduated with this program. I did do a semester of an exchange program in Washington, D.C. at American University. So I felt that I either, the Lord was calling me into a ministry, or if not that, maybe to teach at a college level, or law school. I was interested in politics and that sort of thing. I'd always had a curiosity about law enforcement. So I really didn't decide what to do. I decided what not to do. So I decided I didn't feel secure about I didn't feel unequivocal about the ministry. And I was a pool boy, and I knew if I tried to teach that I was going to be struggling financially. So I backed into law school and went to law school, still not knowing really what the Lord was calling me to, but still not satisfied about the ministry.
Did you go to Stetson Law School?
Still went to Stetson Law School.
Huh.
And finished college in '59, finished law school in '62, and I was appointed as an FBI agent.
Okay.
Spent my term in public service anyway. Decided to come back home to Fort Lauderdale, and by that time I had decided at this point I didn't have a clear understanding or a feeling about the ministry. So I thought maybe because of my interest in public service, that maybe the Lord was calling me into a political life, public service. So I resigned, came back to Fort Lauderdale, opened an office, started practicing law, and after 2 or 3 years, I ran for and was elected as the prosecuting attorney for Broward County. Through a crazy circuit of political issues, local, I wound up resigning before the end of my term and going back into private practice. And this was in the late 60s and early 70s, where it seemed to me that the culture wars were just starting.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me like the whole world was turning upside down. And so I resigned from office and started trying to understand what was happening to Western civilization, what was happening to my world. And for about 8 years, I read everything, as I said then, from Aristotle to Zen, trying to get a handle on what was going on in my world. And that turned into probably a 30-year study of Western civilization, essentially. and which culminated in 2005 in the writing of a book. I couldn't find anybody I understood that I agreed with, and it occurred to me that whereas the world was going down a road of relativism, that there was no absolutes, it occurred to me that the central formula for the 20th century was E equals mc squared. And in that formula, the c stands for the constant speed of light. So at least scientifically, there is such a thing as constant value in the world. And so...
This is all the stuff I never understood. I went to law school because I didn't understand this stuff.
So anyway, it occurred to me that Hebrews 13:8 says Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So Christ then becomes the constant Christ. And so that became, that developed a scenario, and so I wrote the first book entitled The Gospel According to Relativity, Constant Value in a Changing World, in which I applied this model to Western civilization in part 1 of the book. And then I applied the same model to the rest of the non-Christian world in part 2 of the book. And my original idea was to have a part 3 of the book in which I would try to apply that same model to the scripture, to the Bible. And I decided that would make it, the book would be too long, and the style of the third part would have been so different from the first two. First two were more philosophical, and the third one, of course, would be scriptural. So anyway, to make a long story short, I didn't include it in that first book. And so in 2012, I guess, I turned that, or during those years, I turned that part 3 into another book, which is entitled Christianity and the Outsider. A lawyer looks at justice and justification. So that's been kind of the
Were you going to Knox at that point?
I started at some point, probably, and this project kind of destroyed my legal career. I wasn't interested in I still did enough to try to make a living. Yeah. In Dallas, in my FBI assignment, I had a daughter in Dallas and one in Cleveland, Ohio. Then we came back down here. We had two boys, so I had a big family to support. Anyway, so somewhere along the line, I wasn't brave enough, as you guys, to take classes for credit. So I did it the easy way and started just taking auditing classes. So I've probably taken just about every class at Knox over the last 20 years, I suppose. So anyway.
Well, you're very welcome.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
And I'm part of the reason I'm in here today is that I've got a third book entitled The Journey, or Our Journey, okay. In which in one of my writers group, they call it a modern Pilgrim's Progress, in which I take a man, a lawyer, who's having a midlife crisis. So the book starts off in
That's
the family.
Most lawyers. That's most middle-aged lawyers.
It starts off, so to speak, in the family room, and it goes through Carlsbad Caverns, which is a famous cave in New Mexico. And of course, the cave is like a art museum. All the rock formations have names, and the rooms, the scenic rooms, there are 7 scenic rooms. And so the cave actually becomes a character in the story, a fiction story. And so it goes from the family room as a vacation tour through creation and the fall and justification, and resurrection, and the throne room at the end. So
Cool.
I haven't been able to be satisfied with it, so I'm hoping that this class will help me deal with that.
Well, let's go another 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll take a break. It looks like at least one person has figured out that there are some snacks back there, because I see they look like they've been disturbed. So our registrar, Lori, always makes amazing food for these intensives. So if there's nothing else you get out of the class, you're going to get amazing food from Lori. Today, at least, because we were starting at 9:30, we decided to put them in the back of the class. For the rest of the week, they'll probably be upstairs, and I could show you where to find that if you need that. But let's take another 10 or 15 minutes of chatting together about some of this, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back. Let me grab a copy of the syllabus and go ahead and pull out your copy if you have it, or if you have it online, if you want to pull that up. We'll talk a little bit about how the class is going to be run. So today we started a little bit late. We started at 9:30. The other days, if it's okay, let's try to start at 9. Is that okay? I thought it might be nice to just start a little bit later the first day. It gave me a little bit more time, and hopefully all of you, we weren't counting on a vehicle breaking down, so hopefully that doesn't happen again. If you take a look at the syllabus, I thought we would quickly scan over the texts we're going to be covering this week. So the way I've organized the class is that basically there are 8 core texts. Okay, so you'll see on the second page of the syllabus the texts that we're going to be going through. We're going to move pretty steadily through each one of them. So the order that you see them there is pretty much the order we're going to work through them. Today, we shouldn't get much further than the Iliad. So hopefully you have your copy of the Iliad. How many of you were successful in actually getting the Robert Fagles translation? So this one I have here. So you've got it, Abe.
This is the one I bought.
Anybody else have the Robert Fagles? It's okay if you don't. You've got it online?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's okay if you have a different translation. The only comment I'll make about that is if you have the Lattimore translation or you have another translation of the Iliad, and this is true for other books as well that are in translation, at times you might find yourself a little frustrated because I'll say, turn to page 3. Well, your page 3 is probably going to be different than mine, so you may have to look a little bit harder. It's helpful for me to know, though, it seems like everybody at least can look on with the Fagles edition. So, but just raise your hand if I'm moving a little bit too fast in terms of textual references. You know, if I'm saying, look at page 15 and it's taking you 5 minutes to actually get there because it's actually page 25 for you, just raise your hand and tell me it's taking a little bit longer, and I'll try to spend a little more time directing you. You know, there are ways to do that. You can talk about book and line numbers as well. So, but yeah, as you look at page 2 of the syllabus, you'll see we've got 8 core works that are assigned for the class. So we've got the Iliad, we have the Aeneid, we have Beowulf, we have the Song of Roland, we have Don Quixote, we have Moby Dick, Lord of the Rings, and East of Eden. Those are our core epic books. Those books, when they were assigned, I gave you particular sections that I told you would be assessed. Okay, so I expect that some of you probably went a little bit beyond that and read a little bit more. That's great. But in terms of the assessment, that's what you were expected to have read by the time of the class. The way that that's going to be assessed in the class is that on the last day, I will give you a reading certification quiz, and I will ask you how much of the material you read. I should say this now, but I'll say it on Friday as well. Be gracious with yourself in terms of how you answer that. When I'm asking you how much of the text, the assigned portions of the text you read, I'm not asking you how much of it you could teach on or recreate from memory. I'm just asking you if you read it. Does that make sense? You know, I tend to be hard on myself in terms of those kind of assessments, and I think, well, I skimmed this bit a little bit too much or whatever. If you've read it, I'm going to give you credit for it. Does that make sense? So don't beat yourself up and say, well, you know, chapter 3 of East of Eden was a little bit tough, and I kind of went through it a little too fast. That's okay. There are going to be parts that you probably sped through a little bit faster than others. Does that make sense? So feel free to be generous with yourself in terms of that assessment. I should also mention that there are other epics that I will make reference to during the class. And you saw this on the syllabus, hopefully. You are not expected to have read them. Okay, so if I make reference to Homer's Odyssey, I will try to do that in a way that if you didn't read Homer's Odyssey, it'll still make sense and you'll understand why I'm bringing it up in the class. This was a difficult process for me. This is the first time that this class is being offered. It is the first class that I'm teaching as an intensive. It's the first class I'm being filmed for. So in a certain sense, you guys are my guinea pigs. I'm super excited about it, and I hope my enthusiasm will make up for some of the glitches that may occur along the way. But one of the things that happened as I was putting together these readings is I had to cut out books that I wanted to include. And I felt a little bit like that Civil War doctor, you know, sawing off a limb. You know, it's like, we can't include the Odyssey. But I thought you're going to have a lot of Homer with the Iliad, and I thought it would overwhelm you if I assigned the Odyssey as well. So be aware that I'm aware that there are other texts that could very well be considered epics. We are scratching the surface of epic in this class. What I did try to do for these 8 works is have them pass kind of the stupid test, which is I don't want at the end of the class you to be wondering why a particular text was included in the assigned reading. Okay? If there's any book that you're going to read in terms of an epic class, it should probably be Homer's Iliad. So that should pass that kind of basic test of, you know, why was that included? Well, because in a certain sense it invents the genre of epic to a great extent, at least in the West. It's also worth mentioning that this is a very Western-based course. So there are epics outside of Western literature. And I'll make reference to some of them. There's a few famous Indian epics. I am primarily a scholar of Western literature and not Eastern literature. That does not mean that I believe that there's no value to reading those. It just means I'm more in my comfort zone in this kind of range, and we didn't have a chance to cover everything. Okay. A few other comments just about how the class is going to run. As I mentioned, we'll try to start at 9 if that's okay. Try to get here just a few minutes before that so you can get settled. We will have coffee in the back. We're going to have, as I mentioned, some snacks that will typically be upstairs for the other days. Try to be here for every class of the intensive if you can. If for any reason you've got to leave for part of it, I would appreciate it if you let me know. Because it's being offered as an intensive, if you miss a day, it's not like missing a typical day during one of our residential classes. I mean, you're missing essentially 1/5 of the entire class with one day. Participation for the class is going to be part of what you're going to be graded on, along with the reading. I'm very gracious and generous when it comes to grading participation. I'm not going to mark you down if you get something wrong. Okay? So partly that is because I'm probably going to get something wrong along the way. Okay, so somebody's going to ask me who Homer's sister-in-law was or something like that, and I'll get this terrified deer in the headlights look, and I'll stare right at the camera in the back of our classroom, and I'll start sweating like I was at the beginning of the class. Okay, maybe I'll just close my eyes and say, "Ich dein, I serve," you know, or something like that. Okay, I'll get something wrong too. So I'm not expecting perfection. What I would like though is that you can reasonably engage with the material. So if we're traveling through the text together and there are questions that you have that you feel comfortable asking them, but also if I ask you about something that's a comprehensive type question, you know, did you notice this particular aspect of Book 2 of the Iliad or something like that, hopefully you can pipe up and make your comments. Again, they're not going to be graded down if I tend to disagree with them. Okay, it's not about that. I should also say in that respect that I am giving you one read on each of these texts. There are literally as many interpretations of Homer as there are readers of Homer. I mean, everyone gets a slightly different impression of certain passages. Feel free to disagree. Feel free if I'm telling you, for instance, that my read on Priam's son Paris is that he's a bit of a pretty boy. And the fact that he fights with a bow and arrow and kills people at a distance doesn't speak well of him, especially when he's lined up against Hector. There are plenty of people that would disagree with that. If you do, disagree. And if you feel comfortable, and hopefully you do, tell me. and tell the rest of us why. I'm not here to give you an authoritative take on every single passage so you can walk away with the answer. The goal of the class is that for at least, especially those of you who have never encountered this, that you're excited to go back and encounter it more and more and learn more about it. For those of you who have already encountered it, it's yet another chance for you to rethink your reading of these passages. So hopefully that's clear. Are there any questions about any of that? Okay, so in terms of the assessment, you're going to get a reading certification quiz the last day. Again, be generous with yourself on that. Participation will be assessed, but again, I'm going to be gracious in terms of assessing that. You'll also have 2 essays. So you've seen this in the syllabus, I take it. The first essay will be the last day of the class. So our last morning together on Friday, you'll have an amount of time, and we'll agree on a set amount of time that you'll get to talk about one of the texts that we read and how that text can be considered an epic. Okay, so if you choose to pick the Iliad and write on the Iliad, then you will tell me in that essay how the Iliad constitutes an epic. And hopefully after a week of the class, you'll have a real good sense of exactly what an epic is and why the Iliad can be considered one. Does that make sense? You'll then have 2 weeks after you go from here to write the second essay. And that assignment will be picking a text that's outside of the realm of what we've discussed and talking about how that text is an epic as well. Okay, so you'll get a chance to pick another book. And I can give you a little guidance as we get closer to that on what book you might want to pick, but I'd really like you to choose a text and read that text and then write the second essay on why this particular text can be considered an epic using the tools that you honed in this class. Does all that make sense? Okay, let's take just a minute or 2 more and then we'll take our break. Looking at the last page of the syllabus, the tentative schedule, you'll see that I've broken it down into 5 days. One of the things that probably will jump out to you very quickly is that for the 5th day, we only have a morning together. Okay, so my goal will be to have us out of here about noon on Friday, if that's okay. So I don't know if you have to make plans for things as far as traveling home or whatever, but hopefully that's helpful for you. Does everybody think that they can make it through Friday at noon? Okay, cool. We will follow this tentative schedule as best we can. We'll see as we're kind of getting to Thursday how we're doing. You know, we may have moved a little bit faster than I thought. We may have moved a little bit slower. That's fine. I've kind of prepared contingencies I've prepared for both of those contingencies. Does that make sense? All that? It's all good? Any questions before we take a break?
That last paper,
Yes.
how big?
We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that when you leave.
Okay.
It's somewhat negotiable,
Okay.
and it's going to be dependent in part on the book that you choose. Okay? So let's talk about that on Friday. Okay? That's a very good question, though. I intentionally did not delineate that in the syllabus because of that. That's a good question. Other questions? All right. Let's take a break. You want to come back in about 10 minutes? Does that give you enough time? And then we'll go till lunchtime after that if we can.
Do you know the Wi-Fi for here?
Yes.
I have no
Which
idea.
one do you have? Do you have the Coral Ridge? Doug may know it too.
They're all.
If it's the CRPC, it depends which one is popping up for him. Do you know what that is?
Guest
That no one
password
has
is
a
ministry.
password.
It's ministry, Lord.
Ministry.
Make you nervous, the president comes by and checks in on your clients.
That's what he's doing. He's like trying to figure out if he has to kind of step in and take over. You know?
Yeah. Okay.
So we're still waiting on Jen. I guess we can. Did anyone see him? He was headed that way, so we can. Good to go?
Yeah, we can start.
Okay. So a couple more housekeeping things real quick, and then we'll dive into asking the question, what is an epic? It's probably a good question to ask the first day of class on epic, isn't it? One thing is just, you all are doing it, but obviously in the questions, feel free to just ask me questions as Josh. You don't have to say Dr. Bruce or Professor. I go by Josh, so call me Josh, please. The other thing is, the plan for our classes, if it's okay with you all, will be to take an hour-and-a-half long break for lunch. So, you know, we're moving in on the 12 o'clock hour. We'll break at 12, just about, and then you'll have an hour and a half. So if that works for everyone, we can do that every day. It's good. It gives me an opportunity to, you know, jump back to my office and have some lunch and kind of look over my outlines for the next part of the class. Hopefully it gives you guys a chance to actually go somewhere. So Scott is kind of familiar with the area, I'll bet. So he might be the best person to ask if you're looking for, you know, where's the Olive Garden, where's the Smoky Bones, whatever it is you want to go to for lunch. On that, and I see Jim is just walking in here, so I may repeat this a little bit, but my wife and I would love to have you all to our house this week for dinner. And this includes you, Doug, too, so you're very welcome. So Thursday night is probably the night that works best for us. We thought we would do a barbecue. You don't have to bring anything other than yourselves. If you have a spouse who traveled with you or is here locally, she's welcome as well. Hey, sorry, we were just picking up again, Jim. I was just saying that I would love to have everyone to our house for a barbecue during this week. So Thursday night is probably the night that works best for us. I'll give you all the address and I'll give you my number so that you can get in touch with me if anything comes up. But does that, without looking at your schedules, does that sound like something that would work okay? Okay. And again, just bring yourselves. Bring a very low expectation of how much discussion there can be because there are going to be two little boys running around and I'll probably be running after them. I told my son Andrew, who loves the stories in the Iliad, he's been told a number of them, I told him that Daddy was teaching an intensive today, and he said, well, what are you teaching on? And I told him it's that line that you learned, because I taught him the first line of the Iliad, so I taught it to him in a paraphrase, as sing the muse of the wrath of Achilles, the son of Peleus. So I said, I'm teaching them that line that you learned. And he said, oh, that's a great story. They'll love it. Well, we'll see. He's going on 5. That's him at his best. You may end up seeing him at his worst in the evening. So there will be 2 boys running around. I'll probably be on the grill doing hot dogs and hamburgers or something like that. But you're very welcome to join us for dinner. We would love to have you, so please come if you can. And I think that's everything as far as just basic housekeeping issues. Does anything come to mind that you need to ask before we move on? No? Okay. So let's ask the question, what is an epic? What do you think an epic is? You've read a number of books. This is where I pretend to be a Socratic professor. I'm not. This is where I show you that you don't know anything and then I show you all my wisdom. Okay? I'm not. I never particularly appreciated that in law school when a law school professor who had done this for 30 years pretended to know nothing and then turned it on us and showed us that he actually knew everything. So I'm not doing that. I'm just curious, as you're coming into this class, I mean, if you had to define an epic, somebody came up to you on the street and said, I picked up Homer's Iliad and somebody told me it's an epic. What's an epic?
Stories of great journey.
Yeah, okay, so that word in particular, journey, or an adventure of some kind, is critical to thinking about epic. And you want to think of it as a grand journey. An epic is not usually me going to Walgreens to get allergy medicine. I mean, an epic is a hero going on a journey. That's another element that's really important. Okay, so you've seen this, Sam, the hero, right? Tell me a little bit about that. We're looking for a hero of some kind, often.
Yeah, so Me and Abe were talking about this on the way here.
Oh, great.
So
Before the car broke down.
yeah, before the car broke down, we had 4 hours. So yeah, there's a hero, and we were talking about how it relates to comedy, because we were talking actually about Lord of the Rings, because it kind of seems like a comedy, but is there, in this story of a hero, does the hero start off where you don't really believe in him, or is that more of the comedy? I wasn't really sure, but yeah, I know there's a hero that's central to a...
Let's do something before we go any further then. This class, as you know, is a class on epic literature. There are 4 major genres of classic literature. You know this, Abe? Okay. Do you know who first said this and first laid them out in these categories?
Aristotle.
Aristotle, okay, in a work called The Poetics, said that the main ways of expressing truth in literature are to use the epic, the tragic, Sam used the word, the comic, and the lyric genres. I'm always a little bit scared when I write something on a board in a class because I'll inevitably misspell it. Now, the former trial attorney in me thinks, well, how can I use that? I'll establish rapport with the audience. Maybe I'll intentionally misspell it. No, I'm just kidding. But if I do misspell something, it was on purpose, okay? Aristotle says that there are basically 4 genres of literature. And he says there is epic, there is tragic, there is comic, and there is lyric. Now, this is a bit of my paraphrase of Aristotle. If you read the Poetics, which you should do sometime, you'll find that Aristotle uses slightly different terminology at times. So, for instance, he calls the lyric the dithyrambic, the type of literature that perhaps would be sung to a lyre, okay? Let's talk a little bit about each of these, but then I want to hone in on the class that we're in, which is the epic class. I'll tell you by way of an advertisement that there are 4 core classes that are based on these literary genres in the program as it's being kind of unveiled. So there are going to be classes on epic, tragic, comic, and lyric. You guys are in the first class. You're in the epic class, which is very exciting. So we're going to focus on epic, but let's just talk very briefly about what each of these 4 are, and then we'll circle back to epic, and we'll hopefully get a better sense of what that is. So let's talk about tragic literature. What do you think about when you think of a tragedy? Yeah.
Well, those are the ones that start high and end low.
They often start high and end low. When you take the tragic class, you'll read about a character named Oedipus, Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the king. He begins in the story at a very high point. He's married to a wonderful woman named Jocasta, and he has children with her, and he thinks things are going really well. It's high, right? Quickly, though, he realizes that he has done about the worst thing that anyone could do. He has killed his father, and he has married, unbeknownst to him, his mother, and had children with her. I won't spoil everything, but let's just say it ends low after that realization. Some of you have had classes in the program where you read Oedipus, so you're familiar with that narrative. So if you think of a tragedy, it's kind of what it sounds like. It begins high and it ends low. There are many other characteristics of tragedy that we will talk about in the tragic class. We're not worried about that right now, but it's good to kind of set it apart from epic. What's a comedy?
The reverse.
Yeah, kind of the reverse. Now this is very simplistic. Take the comic class. We'll talk about it at much more length, I promise. Okay? You'll have either an intensive or a full semester on it. But in essence, it's a reverse. It's a Cinderella story. It is the princess who begins life in the basement, doing the chores for the household, and ends married to the prince. Okay? So if tragic begins high and ends low, comedy often begins low and ends high. Again, many other characteristics that we can talk about, but we'll talk about them when we do those classes. Finally, lyric. What do you think of when you think of lyric? I'm guessing it's the thing that most of us probably have the hardest time with. Okay? Lyric is the poetry of Byron. Lyric is the Song of Solomon. Lyric is often timeless. It can be very romantic. Okay? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate, and so on. I won't embarrass myself by reciting the whole sonnet. Okay? You think of some of Shakespeare's sonnets. You think of a timeless genre which isn't set in a particular location necessarily and describes a timeless love or a timeless feeling. Okay? You want to know more? Well, here's the ad for the lyric class. Take the lyric class. We'll talk about it more. We'll read these things together. But let's circle back to epic now. Because I'll submit to you, and this is important for you to know this going forward, that epic can sometimes encompass these other genres. You know this, Abe, and some of you have taken these other classes already in the program where you've talked about this a bit. A book like the Iliad, a work like the Iliad, probably is a tragic epic, okay? It ends with a very tragic scene that we're going to talk about. It begins in the middle of a great battle, okay? A work like Don Quixote, I hope all of you have already seen, that's pretty comic. If you think that a man that thinks he's a great knight and basically staples a makeshift helmet onto his head and then has to be fed through a straw when he eats at the end, if you think that that is tragic, you're probably missing the comic genre. It's funny, okay? And an epic can contain within it lyric passages. We're going to talk today about Hector, the warrior who goes and sees his son Astyanax and speaks to him and tells him about his hopes and dreams for him as a son of a great warrior. Okay? That has kind of a timeless lyric feeling to it. I, as a father, read that every time I cry, usually for a slightly different reason. That's a lyric passage that can be found within an epic. Okay? So here are the four major genres which track the four literature-based core courses in this new program as it's getting unveiled here. But we're in the epic class. So let's go back to that. We said that epic is often about grand journeys. It often has heroes. Okay? What other kinds of things can we say about it?
I read the introduction by the Epic Cosmos.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
okay.
And one of the terms that was used there is cosmopoiesis.
Yes.
Poiesis.
Yes.
And from what I remember from it, it's like the idea of it, it builds from it this particular work. You can
Yes.
almost build a way of life.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so Abe is making reference to a book that I gave you in the syllabus, not as an assigned work, but as a possible reference. Great work reading that introduction, that's wonderful. This is an edited volume by a number of scholars who have had a great influence on me. They've had a great influence on a number of people who have taught in this curriculum, who probably will be teaching in this curriculum in the future. A number of scholars originally based at the University of Dallas. The most famous of them is a woman named Louise Cowan, a wonderful scholar of literature, who is famous for articulating these four genres of literature: the epic, tragic, comic, and lyric genres. She's probably the most important person in the last 100 years who's articulated that fourfold division. Okay? Now, one of the things that is discussed in this edited volume, and especially in the introduction, is the idea of something called a cosmopoiesis. Right? It is a literary world, a grand literary world. Think of Tolkien. Okay, think of Tolkien inventing a language and then working out a world that exists that speaks that language. I mean, this is a grand task, isn't it? This isn't me sitting down and writing a little love poem for my wife. It's taken me 12 years of marriage, by the way, to realize that my scientist wife doesn't appreciate love poetry. So last time I gave her a love poem for Valentine's Day, she held it kind of like it was a dirty diaper. It was kind of like, what do I do with this? I go the more practical route. You know, I'm learning, 12 years in. But you get the sense that there is this like grand scale to everything in an epic. And we'll recap all of this through the class, and we'll recap it especially on Friday. So if you're scurrying to write all this down, we will come back to this. Okay, this isn't your one shot to get this down. But we have a journey, we have a hero, we have a grand scale to things, a grand world of some kind. Think of the Iliad. You know, this is a massive battle. You get the sense of like World War II. You know, D-Day, the Normandy landings. You know, the fate of the world hangs on this event. It's grand. It isn't very particular. It isn't two people engaged in some sort of side project. This is the fate of the world at stake. Other things. What else could we look at? Yeah.
There just seems to be like a kind of like a defense of ideals, meaning there's always a knight who people look up to, and he kind of represents. He has some valuable characteristics. So I mean, Don Quixote kind of turns into comedy, but I think for the rest of them, there's someone who you admire just because of certain ideals that he's willing to die for.
Yeah. So you often have characters who represent very, very broad characteristics, either virtues or vices. The Roman historian Livy, when he writes his history of ancient Rome, begins his history by saying that history is the best medicine for the sick mind. It's a great way of thinking about history, isn't it? I tell my church history classes this when we do church history. Why are you doing this? Because you have sick minds and you need medicine. But what he goes on to say is he says that history gives us exemplars, virtues to be imitated, and vices to be avoided. So when we read about, you know, the Roman Emperor Nero, for instance, and Suetonius, you know, who thought that he had a beautiful singing voice. Nobody else did, of course. So he would hold performances where he would sing, and he would have them bar the doors to keep people from leaving. He put soldiers at the doors. This is a tip for you guys that are pastors. No, I'm just kidding. You know, you put guards at the doors. But Suetonius says that women would fake going into labor, and men would fake dying just to get out of the terrible singing. Okay. Now this is funny, of course, but there's a lesson to be taught here. As you smirk, okay, you think of a terrible dictator today. You think of somebody who's just gone off the rails with vast amounts of power. And it's not that far removed from certain dictators that we can see around the world today, right? You learn from this. And the more vivid the presentation of it, the more memorable. See, I read that 18 years ago, and it stuck with me. It's still there. I have this memory of thinking of somebody trying to get out of the room as Nero is singing. The other thing Suetonius says that's wonderful is that Nero would get down from the stage and ask people, so how do you think I did? You know? But he's emperor. He can kill them if they tell him he said something he doesn't like. But it's vivid, okay? Epics often present grand narratives in which there are heroes, but there are also villains, okay? Or we could say anti-heroes. People who don't just model beautiful virtues, but model heinous vices. Does that make sense? So you have both being presented in a grand way. Sometimes a hero can model both. Okay? Sometimes a hero can show a particular virtue. Nobody reading the Iliad would say that Achilles isn't brave. He's very brave, but he's full of rage. Right? The first line of the Iliad, rage. That's why I asked you to read the Fagel's translation. Rage. The Greek word is menon. Menon aida thea peliedio Achilleos. Rage, same goddess. Right? Achilles is full of rage. Most of us would say, especially misdirected, that that's a vice. We'll talk about it. But here you can have someone like Achilles who's very brave in battle. Perhaps that's good. But he's also full of rage. He's full of rage for his honor. So you can have these grand narratives in an epic where characters model grand virtues and grand vices. What other kinds of things do we see in epics? Sure.
Is it the epic that has the idea that you begin in the middle of the story?
Well, we're going to talk about that.
Okay.
Sometimes epics do.
Okay.
So this epic that we're going to deal with first, the Iliad, isn't just in the middle of the story, it's toward the end of the story, isn't it? Yeah. There's been 10 years of warfare, and we meet these characters a few weeks before the end. So an epic can just throw you into the middle of it. We'll talk about that in other genres as well, but that's an interesting comment, yeah. What about the involvement of gods and goddesses? see this in the Iliad, okay? A god or a goddess taking a personal interest in the battle. We'll see a passage when we come back, probably after lunch here, where Achilles is getting ready to draw his sword and attack Agamemnon, and in comes Athena. Stop! The Greeks had a way of describing it that the Romans picked up, and in Latin, it's often called the Deus ex machina. Has anyone seen that phrase? Okay. Non-literally, it means something like a god out of nowhere, just swooping down. Okay. And you see that a lot in an epic. How do epics often begin? What is the wording of an epic? We've seen it several times in the early epics that we read, the Iliad and the Aeneid. It's also true of the Odyssey. What does the author do at the very outset? The person who's writing or singing the epic, what do you do to begin? Yeah.
Consult the muse.
Yeah, you invoke the muse, okay? You invoke a goddess to tell this story through you. There's been a tremendous amount of literature on works like Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey as far as how they would have been presented to their original audience, okay? But it is likely that works like the Iliad were often recited to people who heard them rather than reading them. You're all familiar with this? You're comfortable with this idea? Okay. What does that mean? It means that perhaps you've had a giant feast. If you're Greek, you've chopped up large chunks of meat and roasted them on sticks. I just get hungry at the end of a Greek epic, either the Iliad or the Odyssey. I want to go to Smoky Bones and get my large chunks of meat. But you've chopped up large chunks of meat. You've eaten them, then you've drunk wine out of very shallow bowls of wine, usually diluted wine of some kind. And when you've put away hunger and thirst, a bard, a storyteller, will stand up and recite a grand tale. Homer may have been one of those people. All sorts of scholarship on Homer that we'll talk about after we come back, if any of you are interested. But someone like Homer stands up and says, "Rage, goddess, sing." And everyone says, this is going to be a good story. A muse is being invoked. I put away hunger, I put away thirst. Now I get a chance to hear an incredible story. What kinds of stories do they tell? We haven't quite gotten to one of the key elements of an epic. What kinds of stories, sometimes called myths, are told in an epic? What do you want to know about? If you're a Greek at the end of the 8th century, when we think that Homer probably lived and compiled this and presented this, what are you hearing about? What is it telling you about?
Maybe, I know myths in general, they are talking about how we began, where we come from.
Yeah.
So maybe they're trying to find their identity of where they come from.
An epic is often telling a founding story, okay? An origin story. Where did I come from? That's true. That's where you came from. I don't tell them your great-grandfather was a gardener who came over from Scotland 80 years ago. No, your ancestor, was a king of Scotland. I don't tell them all the nasty stuff about what he did when he harried the North. I don't tell them all the nasty things he did. I just say, there's Robert the Bruce, there's your ancestor. But that's a founding story that you tell a child. An epic is often answering the question, how do we get here? How do we get here? Think of some founding epics. Obviously, the Iliad and later the Odyssey. You did not read the Odyssey for this class, but the Iliad and the Odyssey in their own ways are telling the story of the origin of Greece. Okay, where do we come from? What are we like as Greeks? One of the beauties of the Odyssey, and one of the reasons I was torn about not including it, is it tells a story of a man of many ways, Odysseus, a man of crafty designs. Many Greek hearers of that are thinking, yeah, that's us. The rational man, a man who, as Odysseus often does, will say, I am a man of many ways who tells many lies. Now listen to the story I tell and believe every word of it. Right? I'm so good at telling a lie. But a Greek hears that and thinks, is that us? Is that what we're like? Okay, it's a story about where you came from, your ancestors. Think of the Aeneid, which you did read in this course. We're not descended from some farmers who eventually took over the civilization that they grew up in. We are descended from Aeneas, one of the royalty, one of the members of the royal house of Troy who fled when the city fell. Virgil is telling a founding myth. By the way, there's some really cool prophecies about somebody who's going to come along, somebody from the Julian line who's going to be Augustus Caesar, who's going to bring peace and prosperity. Thank you, Augustus, for paying me. Okay? I mean, that's how a founding story works. Now, one of the things, and we'll talk about this more as we travel along, one of the things that you can find is that people can tweak and play with these motifs. Okay? If you know that an epic is supposed to tell you something, you can play with that, and you can adjust that, and you can say things that are a bit unexpected as you go along. Don Quixote is a perfect example of this. Here's a knight who's going to found an order of chivalry, where we strap our cardboard helmets to our head, and when we drink at the tavern, we drink through a giant straw. I mean, that's playing with your expectations in a really kind of fun way, isn't it? What else can an epic do? We've missed one or two very key things.
Yeah, kind of a glorification of war.
Oh man, I mean the Iliad in particular, right? There was a 20th century Christian philosopher who wrote an essay on the Iliad in particular. Simone Weil, you heard of Simone Weil, French philosopher? She died under the Nazis in the 1940s. And she said the Iliad is about
what was the name?
Simone Weil. The last name is Weil, I believe. And she said that the Iliad is about force. And it really is, isn't it? And you find this in a lot of epics. There are grand journeys and grand adventures that often involve grand battles. Probably turned away a little bit at some of the passages that describe someone's guts flowing out of them when they've been speared. I mean, there's often a glorification of war. We'll talk after lunch about the Iliad in particular, but one of the main debates in Homeric scholarship when it comes to the Iliad is the Iliad glorifying war, or is it telling us how bad war is? And there's a debate about that. But it's certainly presenting war in all of its kind of vagaries of style. I mean, the chariots, the armor, page after page spent on Achilles' shield. Achilles' armor that he gives to Patroclus that's stripped off of him when Hector kills Patroclus. And now Hector's wearing that armor. The horsehair helmet of Hector of the flashing helmet. I mean, these are descriptions of men who are at war. The Aeneid that we'll get to tomorrow, Arma verumque cano, I sing of arms and a man at arms, right? This is talking about war a lot. Did you want to say more about that? I mean, battles as well.
I was just wondering what your take is. I hate to jump to the end of the story, but it seems to me that everything that you've said so far and everything that we've looked at and read is talking about the grandness of everything. And what a contrast that is, even in the study of history, where in the modern era, basically we have turned away from the larger narrative. And history now is no longer that big picture, but it is zeroing in on the movie that now shows the person in the toilet, going to the bathroom. Sure. And you have
the mundane.
It's a contrast between the largeness of the world and the narrative and the smallness. And you see it all the way across the board. You see here the sense of war and what that means and so forth. And of course now everything is anti-war, and all the good people are protesters and against any kind of violence and so forth. And so it just seems to me that this is a in my writing, I would refer to it as a fixed frame of reference, in which there's been this larger picture, and now we have arrived at a point in terms of modernity in which there is no frame of reference.
I mean, that's
probably. I mean, that's a picture of philosophical relativism, isn't it, right? There's no meaning, there's no rationale, and so it's one extreme or the other.
We will see, though, even in early epics, and I think you all will find this interesting as well, times when there is a focus on something that's very, very specific and very particular.
But it's always within the larger.
It's often within a larger narrative. That's true.
So it's
That's
always
true.
within the fixed frame.
One of the things that will be fun, just going back to a point I made just a few minutes ago, when it comes to authors who can take your expectations and somewhat play with them, is when we see things like what you're talking about. I mean, one of the first 20th century examples of that would be somebody named James Joyce, who wrote a work called the Ulysses, which is a rewriting of Homer and the Odyssey, and often, to Jim's point, portraying a hero who is accomplishing very mundane tasks, getting a pork chop at a local cafe. And he's presented as like the new Ulysses, that's the Roman name for Odysseus, and that you do see a bit of a shift there, don't you? The other thing, though, that you'll see a shift on, and I'm excited to walk through this with you all, has to do with the sense in which, as the epic travels through history, and especially in Western history, what happens to it when Christians start writing epics? Okay, because there's an expectation of certain things, if you're writing an epic, okay, that Christians will also take, and they will do things with those motifs that you might not have expected. One point to make here that I'll kind of throw out and then retreat from very quickly, because we'll get to it in a number of days, is just what somebody like Tolkien, a person who was profoundly influenced by the very grand narrative of Christian redemption, does when he writes an epic. Who are his heroes in that epic? And how do they line up against, say, classical heroes? Is there a sense in which he's playing with our expectations in an interesting way? And I think it points to there is. But I take your point, and I think that you're right, that there is, especially in the 20th century and onward, often a lack of that grand narrative and a lack of a shared sense of what that narrative might be, and where we fit in it.
You mentioned with the Dallas group that you were
Yes.
talking about earlier,
Yes.
Which it almost seems to me like sort of a rebirth
Yes.
of this interest in epic
Yes.
and the whole scenario. And I'm wondering what your thought is as that being a pushback against this modern no frame of reference. So
I mean, it is.
yeah,
I mean, that's the answer. It is.
kind of a rebirth
Yeah.
of a focus maybe on
Yeah.
epic, the grand epic of the past.
It is a recognition of the fact that we all live within a meta-narrative of some kind. And people who deny any kind of meta-narrative are living within a meta-narrative of their own, right? You know what I'm talking about if I say a meta-narrative, a grand view of reality, of
And if
history.
If you think of really the whole French deconstructive and the postmodern mentality, I mean, meta-narrative is a dirty word for all of them. And so everything really since 1945, in effect, has been a reaction against the meta-narrative.
Yep, very much so. And so I want to touch on one other point when it comes to epic, and then we're going to come back to this, because that segues us very nicely into what I was hoping to spend the rest of our time until lunch talking about, which is what we do with this, why this matters. In particular, why it matters to us as Christians. We have a meta-narrative, do we not? We have a grand view of the world, and so why do we care about epic? Well, we need to talk about that. And if it'd be interesting at that point for you to jump back in terms of how that might contrast with other views that are surrounding us in many ways. But let's talk about one more thing when it comes to epic. It's the one point that I think we've left off. And again, if you're scrambling to write these down and you're thinking this is your one chance, it's not. We're going to come back to these over and over, and then at the end you'll get a list that we've put together of characteristics of an epic, okay? But feel free to take notes as we go along as well. The one other thing that I would say that an epic does for us is it often tells a really profound story of a fall. A fall, F-A-L-L. Not like fall, the season, but a fall of a civilization or a city. I mean, this is what we're talking about when we read the Iliad, is it not? This is Priam and his 50 sons in their last weeks. This is the grand civilization of Troy and the Trojans in their last weeks. And the final line of the Iliad that we'll get to will be about the death of Hector, the breaker of horses. Okay? We'll talk about why that might be significant, why the breaker of horses is dead and what that means for the city of Troy. Who's going to fall to a wooden horse, right? I mean, this is significant, but it's a story of a fall. Now, and this is a nice way of kind of transitioning into the last topic before lunch, but we as Christians have a story of a fall, do we not? We believe that essentially there once was a time when things were the way they ought to be, and there was a fall from that. Epics often tell stories not just of origins, but of endings. Okay, so they are often going to tell a story not just about, here's where the Greeks came from, here are characteristics of the Greeks, but whatever happened to those Trojans, right? The Aeneid is going to portray a queen named Dido, who's the queen of Carthage. Well, Carthage is going to fight 3 wars with the Romans by the time that Virgil writes the Aeneid, and they're going to lose all of them. They're going to be destroyed by Rome. There's a legend that the Romans hated Carthage so much that they actually sowed the fields with salt to keep them from growing again. Probably didn't happen, but it gives you a sense of how that was perceived. You have this story about a great Roman politician during those periods who apparently would end every speech. You were in politics a bit, so you end every political speech with Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. You know, talking about tax policy. You know, you got to sit down. One more thing. Carthage must be destroyed. You know, there's this hatred between Rome and Carthage, but the Aeneid is about Carthage in part. I mean, it features very prominently this woman who is jilted by Aeneas. Says it's been real, but I gotta go, right? And she does the perfectly reasonable thing. She creates a funeral pyre. She jumps on it, stabs herself, and lights herself on fire as he's sailing away. You know, I've taught classics at high school level for many, many years, and I once had a high school girl write in the evaluation of the class. She said, "I thought the classics were boring until I read about Dido." She said, "I've broken up with my boyfriend, and that is one breakup story." You know, you get the sense though that there is a story not just about the origins of a civilization, but a great civilization that is falling and coming unglued. And that's what we see in a number of these epics. I want to kind of transition this into a discussion of why we care, especially why we care as Christians, because I think that's an important conversation to have. You had a comment.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure this out.
Of course.
It seems now that epics are going to start high, because that's the paradigm. That's where we're supposed to be. And then it becomes a tragic.
They do sometimes.
Yeah,
They do.
And then maybe it goes back to a comic, and because the end is always, the beginning always looks like the end.
Well, see, here's the thing. They do sometimes begin high and end low. So if you think of the Iliad, I mean, the Iliad begins in the middle of battles and it ends on a pretty sad note. And I would describe it as a low note. Something like Don Quixote isn't necessarily the same, though. Don Quixote is a comic tragedy, which doesn't follow quite or a comic epic, excuse me. So it doesn't quite follow that narrative. So when you think of high to low, or low to high, you're often thinking about tragic or comic literature, and epics can be either. Does that make sense? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to think about this because if epics, I guess they just always presuppose a high. I don't know, because before there's a war, I think there's going to be peace. I could be talking, this could make no sense. But, I mean, I just see it in the Bible. When you look at the Bible, you have the garden,
Yeah.
That's perfect.
Yep.
And then it's gonna go, you know, chapter 3, it's declining, and then we also have it ending high.
Yep.
In Revelation.
Yep.
Every time, I guess, if you think that an epic tells both the beginning and the end,
Yep.
it's going to be high both times. So that means if there's going to be any merit worth reading it has to be low at least sometimes.
Mm-hmm. It
So
will
it's
have,
going to be
yeah.
that, I don't know, just that movement. I don't know. So
It has highs and lows, unquestionably. But I think what you're gesturing towards is a nice transition into the next part of our conversation, actually, which is we'll talk a little bit about biblical narratives and how those can look like an epic genre. We'll talk about why we care about epic as Christians. So you're right about a number of the things you're saying there, but let's transition into that, and then hopefully that conversation will explain what you're talking about. Does that make sense?
yeah.
Okay. So why do we care? And I mean, this is true not just with epic, it's true with all of these categories. It's true when it comes to comedy, it's true when it comes to tragedy and lyric as well. I mean, why do we care, not just as people, okay? I read some of these narratives and I find myself just personally gripped by them. Some of that is because I'm a Christian, I was raised in a Christian family, I come from a Christian tradition, I have that broad perspective on the world. So some of it is undoubtedly that. But plenty of Homer scholars are not Christians, and they are gripped by that narrative too. So there's part of it that is just being a human, being created in the image of God, and finding the beauty of a story. We're going to read after the break, after the lunch break, about Hector of the flashing helmet. It's a giant horsehair helmet who is about to go into battle, a battle he thinks he'll probably lose. A great deal of fatalism on Hector's part. And he goes up to his infant son, Astyanax. And in the narrative, we're told that Astyanax pulls away from the horsehair helmet, right? Because the little baby knows enough to know that horses can be scary. Unlike the Trojans, who are like, sure, we'll bring the horse right into the city. Tear down the wall if we have to, we'll bring him right in, okay? You can allegorize that passage. You can talk about how the fall of Troy is found right in that passage where Hector goes to reach for his child and his child pulls away, okay? You can. Or you have a dad who's picking up his little kid.
Right.
And there's something that's just common to human nature. I mean, kids are scared of new things, and a big horsehair helmet is scary. You can study that for 30 years and find all sorts of meaning in it, and never add to the simple fact, ultimately, that this is a dad with his child getting ready to go into battle that he may never see again. So there's something just profoundly gripping about it. And I'll tell you my own story of how I've encountered these things myself at a number of points when we come back. But there's a sense in which this is gripping you as a person, but why would it grip us as Christians? I mean, why do we care about epic or any of these genres? Yeah.
I think in the first course in Plato and Augustine, Gage wanted us to get the book Invitation to the Classic, edited by both Guinness and Cowan. Edited by
Os Guinness and Louise Cowan, who's one of the authors in this series here. Yes. Oh, you have it. Excellent.
Oh, you know. Okay,
is everyone familiar to Invitation to the Classics? That work? If you're not, it's a really helpful introduction. So for a couple of you, please.
One of the great things about that book is that it shows you how each of the stories has like seeds of the gospel in it.
Sure.
The suffering righteous person is one that comes up over and over again. And I think that I don't know if you can necessarily prove this sort of idea, but all stories in some way have this aspect of God's scheme of redemption for us. And you can take that really far, but also it's just that's what we as human beings are craving. And I think these stories connect to us because there is some sort of gospel in that. That may be a negative gospel, and we read it and go, that was terrible, What is that? Why is it terrible? I think it kind of points us to something bigger.
Yeah, you have been, I'm sure most if not all of you are familiar with this metaphor that's told by a number of the church fathers, but Augustine, as usual, summarizes in the way that he becomes famous for, which is the notion of plundering the Egyptians. You've all heard of this, when the Israelites left the house of bondage in Egypt, when they went into the promised land, they made out like gangbusters on all of the Egyptian stuff. I mean, they just took as much as they possibly could. And in the Exodus narrative, we're told that the Egyptians wanted them to leave so badly they were just giving them stuff. Right? Not an Old Testament scholar, so don't challenge me too much on the details, but you get the idea. They left with a lot of the Egyptian stuff. Augustine and other church fathers will say, when I read Plato, and I'm paraphrasing him here, but when I read Plato, I'm plundering the Egyptians. When I read Homer, I'm plundering the Egyptians. I am taking something that is good, that can be used for good, from people who might have used it for bad purposes, but if it's good, I can take that and I can appropriate that. Okay? I'm not encouraging you to steal. I'm encouraging you to plunder the Egyptians. You know, that is what we're doing as Christians, in part, when we read these things. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at, is it not?
Yeah.
That when I read about a Greek notion of a hero, like Achilles, who is full of rage, who secures immortality for himself by killing and slaughtering countless people in combat, and then I contrast that with Christian notions of heroism, okay? I see some significant things, including in the heroism of someone who actually dies for those he loves, dies the death of a criminal. I mean, there are just really fascinating contrasts to make, aren't there? So that's one aspect of why we should care. Jonathan Edwards famously said that all truth is God's truth. Right? If we are finding truth, and we are finding it in Homer, that's ours. You know, I can say as a Christian, that's mine. Other thoughts? And there's more here, I think. There's more, especially for those of you who teach or in a pastoral capacity. There's a lot that you can think about here. Yeah.
I think it was mentioned earlier that this is kind of like a book of morals that we see personified in people.
Yeah.
And
I think Jose was saying that.
Yeah. And I think that is very valuable for us to be able to question these hard things that we're going to start reading about, these problems that are common to all people, but we're going to see these characters in the stories show what it is to be courageous, show what it is to be just.
So there's multiple levels of this. On the one level, we are going to see virtue in these characters that we believe as Christians is ultimately only perfectly modeled by Jesus Christ. I mean, we believe as Christians that Christ is the only man who lived a perfect life. So don't take it the wrong way. It's not pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and if you just get more and more virtue, eventually you'll be perfect. It's not true. Okay, we believe that there's one person who lived a perfect life. And we can see that by contrast, or to a certain extent in its deficiency in some of these examples. Okay, so maybe Achilles shows rage for his own honor and kills. We can see that Christ does something different, right? We can see that Hector dies for those he loves, but not perfectly. He still really enjoys some of the combat, doesn't he? And maybe that's okay. We'll talk about it. But you see that we can learn both by contrast and in a gesture towards something that's ultimately perfected in Christ. So I think this is yet another reason why as Christians we care. We see these models, moral models, that we can imitate, but that we can also appreciate that is ultimately fully fulfilled in Christ. Other thoughts? Thinking especially of those of you who teach or preach. You know, when you're preaching to a congregation, I mean, you are in a sense inviting them to enter into God's story. I mean, are you not? I mean, you as a Christian believe in a story. We are the people of a story. We have a story, both our own stories and God's story. And these are some of the best stories that were ever written. You are reading a number of stories, you are entering into a number of stories, and that is helpful to you as you take people by the hand and invite them into this grand story that we believe in. Is it not? I mean, one of the things that I'll just say personally that I find helpful as we think of these four genres, epic, comic, tragic, and lyric genres, and we'll have a class on each of them again. But one of the things that I think is helpful is when you think about someone who comes to you with a particular question, okay? It's helpful to think about what kind of genre this question is coming from, all right? Is this a tragic question? Is this somebody asking me, You know, my son died 10 years ago. Today is the anniversary. Why did that happen? All right, that's a particularly tragic question, is it not? I mean, this is someone who's grieving. To understand and identify the genre of story is really helpful to you as a teacher and as a pastor. It's helpful to you as someone who's plugged into your family in a meaningful way as a husband or wives. We've got all men sitting physically in the classroom, so as husband, but as wives as well. You know, to think as a father of how to address a child's question. You know, every night for about the last 6 months when I put my two sons to bed, you know, I have a routine where I pray for them every night. I pray, you know, it's a list of prayers that they've now become familiar with, a different one usually every night. But my older son, Andrew, is now obsessed with what if a bad guy broke into the house? And, you know, I don't know if you have kids that are quite that old yet. Yours aren't asking this yet, but they will. You know, he is asking a question that requires kind of an epic response. You know, so I kind of pop my shoulders up, like, look at Daddy. Daddy's big. You know, right? This is an epic response. You know, I don't pull out the crime statistics from Fort Lauderdale. You know? What are the odds, son? You know, that kind of. It's not really helpful. He needs an epic response. Recently, he's taken to, when I do that, when I play my, you know, do you think any bad guy is bigger than Daddy? You know, nobody's bigger than Daddy. I kind of play this up. He'll say, well, and he's talking about one of the professors here. He'll say, Dr. Maynard is bigger than you. I'm like, well, that's probably true, because he could take me. But, you know, he's asking a particular question, and he needs a response that's kind of within a genre. You are hitting things the wrong way if you're misidentifying the genre. You're not learning from this person what they actually need if you're missing what kind of genre they're traveling in right now. This is true for church traditions. Okay, certain traditions in our world of Christianity, this is true in South Florida, but it's true across the country, tend to hit one or another of these genres very hard. We'll talk about how we go through these different classes. Some traditions tend to have a very tragic outlook. Others have a comic outlook. You get what I'm saying. Okay, so this is helpful for navigating all of those different things. Other thoughts on just reading these things as Christians. I mean, you had some thoughts about the culture and engaging the culture. Did you want to say more about any of that?
I was just going to say, in terms of a contrast.
Sure.
It seems to me that the narrative, shall we say, of the postmodern era is really the ultimate tragic, because the ultimate statement is that there is no purpose.
Yeah.
You know, that's the ultimate scenario with pragmatism, or I guess that's the worldly solution. In other words, the worldly solution to put a positive face on it is to assign some sense almost of fate in which whatever works is truth. So you have I guess you would have the epic, the grand scenario in which it has a positive face on it, and the postmodern is that there is no face. In other words, in the smiley face now that you see everywhere, that would be the grand picture, that there is a smile, there is a positive grand picture. The ultimate tragic scenario would be a face in which there are two eyes but no, I mean, it's not even a frown.
Yeah.
It's simply nothing.
Yep.
It's nothing.
Yep.
In a Nietzsche context, God is dead and it is what it is.
Yep.
And I suppose the pragmatist, which is represented, I guess, by Richard Rorty or somebody like that, is a picture in which we impose a fate, as it were, because whatever happens, that is truth.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we're all in our own contexts dealing with, you know, people who are coming from a number of different worldviews, a number of different perspectives. A number of them will line up very, very much along the lines of what Jim is talking about, but where, you know, there is no idea of heroism, for instance. There is no hero. There is no truth. There is no such thing as virtue. There is only power. and I'm sure you've read books or heard speakers, where if someone does something that we, in our naivete, might think of as virtuous, well, they're just looking for power. If they do something terrible, well, they're just looking for power. You know, you can buy into a hermeneutic where there is no such thing as nobility. There is no such thing as the heroism of someone who dies for his or her country or dies for his or her family. Like, that doesn't exist. We're all just kind of muddling along and trying to find truth, which, you know, as you said, for many people is just what we actually see happening. That must be truth. So as Christians, we get to speak into this, don't we? And we get to present our world with a grand narrative. Now, the minutes that remain to us before we break for lunch, I mean, what is it about the Christian narrative that looks like an epic? I mean, when you think about the gospel story, how does that look like an epic? Look like some of the things that we've talked about? What do you think?
Well, it's the ultimate epic.
It's the ultimate epic,
right?
Isn't it?
Because in the final analysis, there is a smile on the smiley face,
Yep.
as opposed to the blank face, which would be so characteristic, it seems to me, of the whole postmodern mentality that you see. For example, I'm sure you're familiar with Foucault,
Oh, yes.
the French writer who says there is nothing but power,
Right.
and that everything is the undergirded by the power, and so in the final analysis, that's all there is. And so it creates a cynic. It gives a cynical scenario to all of people, and that, it seems to me, that's what is being invested in young people today.
Well, there is.
In other words, they have this cynical.
Yeah, there is a tendency, and I'm sure that we all fall into it at times, of having what can be described as kind of a sophomoric view of the world, in which you're always kind of looking through things to see what's really behind this. You know what I'm talking about, right? Virtue is a veneer that's laid over a naked quest for power. You know, so people posture. Now, there is truth to that. Okay, you are going to interact with people who are doing that. That is true. But like every bad idea, it's powerful because it has some truth in it, but it isn't the full story. And you mentioned Michel Foucault, a French philosopher who died in the early 1980s, died of AIDS at the time, I believe. You know, he set the table for a lot of discussions about these things by saying that ultimately what we're doing when we read literature, when we look at politics, we're just determining the quest for power that's beneath all of this. There's nothing but power. Now, some Michel Foucault scholar, I'm sure, would tell me I'm summarizing him too much and doing him a disservice, but in essence, that's largely what he says. And we as Christians believe in something that's a little bit different, don't we? We have a narrative that's a little bit different. So what do we say to that? I mean, we do believe in a hero, right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, from what we were talking about, an epic kind of embodying a origin story.
Yeah.
And I think, like, if you think about it, like Jesus coming down to establish the kingdom of God.
Yep.
So maybe like that's the origin story, maybe.
And even before that, so that's true. So yes, and Scripture also gives us an origin of the world. I mean, we're told that God created the world, that He created it good, that He puts Adam and Eve in the garden, that they fall. So we have an origin, we have a fall in our narrative. So we have creation, we have fall, then we have the story of Christ coming to earth, living a perfect life, dying a death in the place of His people, and then rising again. So we have the story of redemption. And then as you read on, you get to the story of restoration. You get to Revelation. You get to, by the way, Revelation, not Revelations. If you ever see someone posting on Facebook about Revelations, read on, but prepare to be amused rather than edified. But you get the point. You have creation, fall, redemption, and restoration, which follows in some sense a very epic trajectory. Okay? Not every epic follows that, but it is a grand narrative. Where the world came from, what went wrong, how it's being fixed, and what the end looks like. I mean, that is a massive tool in your toolkit when you are preaching or teaching or just sharing what you believe, to say, I'm part of this story. This is God's story for the world. It isn't one in which power is ultimately what makes something right or wrong. It isn't one in which we just can't know, right? I'm fascinated. I'll get in trouble very quickly if we go into too many political side, rabbit trails, but I'm fascinated by how many people of late are now convinced that there is such a thing as truth. Nowadays, everyone's saying, well, we've gotten rid of truth, but there has to be some truth, right? It's problematic when you get rid of that.
Yeah.
But as Christians, we are in a tradition, we're in a worldview that actually believes in truth. We think that we have the narrative. It's not that we have everything figured out. Trust me, if it meant having everything figured out, I'd be in big trouble. It doesn't mean that. It means that we're part of this grand narrative that is God's story for the world. Sam Lamerson, who is our president here at Knox, but also teaches New Testament, always tells this wonderful story, and if you've heard him tell it, you'll know where I'm going with this, but it comes from the movie The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel. You know the movie where the people go to this hotel in India that's pitched as this wonderful resort, and it turns out to be terrible. But the person who works at the counter always tells the story that he says is an Indian story, which is the question, is it the end? Okay? And say, is it the end yet? Say, no. Well, it's not a happy ending. Well, how do you know? Because it's not the end. When it's the end, it'll be a happy ending. That is the story. The story tells us that we know that it's the end when it's happy. And if it's not happy yet, it's not the end. You think of that wonderful line in Lord of the Rings that we'll talk about, has everything bad come untrue? That's when the end happens. And we as Christians buy into that narrative. That's the narrative of our lives, and that's the narrative of the church, and that's the narrative of the world. So it's effective, I think, to travel through this genre, because you're going to pick up more and more, I think, on people that you interact with who are buying into a different narrative, right? Somebody tells you, well, there is no such thing as truth. It's just who wins. Oh, okay. Well, that is one epic narrative, but it's not a good one. I have a different one. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think you see that exact same thing in a guy like Derrida, who is like the cousin of Foucault, in which you
This is
have,
also a French philosopher, end of the 20th
so
century.
you have the early Derrida, and you have the late Derrida, right? And the early Derrida, the whole thing is the deconstructive mentality in which you are deconstructing this whole Western scenario, right?
Yep.
He's deconstructing Plato and the epic and the whole thing, so that you wind up with nothing. And yet, the late Derrida, he comes back in, and now he's breathing life into justice, right, and the gift, and these are the buzzwords that he's talking about. So he has not ended the story, as you say. It's going on, and now he's breathing some kind of new life, so that there's a trace that is even in what has been dismantled and discredited.
And again, we all do this to some extent, but especially when you don't have very much power, there's a tendency to think that everybody who has any power must be just obsessed with it, and they're trying to get one over on you. That can be a kind of sophomoric view of the world. And when you get responsibility, and all of you in the room, and I'm sure many taking this class will have a great deal of responsibility, you realize how difficult that actually is. It's one thing to kind of sit on the sidelines and talk about, well, there is no truth, and all that really exists is just a naked quest for power that we try to hide a little bit. But then when you're put in a position where you've got to make really big decisions, okay? You practice law as I did, and you realize, I may not know every single detail about this case. I've still got to go in front of a judge and make an argument. You're a pastor, somebody comes to you and asks you for advice. You are not going to know every single detail of that situation. You still got to give advice, right? I mean, if the situation is appropriate and you're being asked for advice and it's something you should weigh in on, you still have to. Now, you can look at that and say, well, all we do is look for power, okay? We're all just Achilles trying to get one over on everyone else. Or you can say, no, I have to do this in a Christ-like way, which means if there is power in my hands, using it well. I think we've dealt with that fairly well in terms of other worldviews. Is there anything else that kind of comes to mind? I'd be especially curious, those of you who, were probably reading all this up until the last minute. It's understandable, As you were reading it up to the last minute and maybe, doing a church service yesterday or something like that, I mean, is there anything that kind of came to mind, where you're like, man, that's why I'm reading this? Anything else that just has fallen through the cracks so far about why we would read these things as Christians? I have one other thing I think of, but may not be the same for you. I find it to be a good break from all other sorts of things. It beats
Good break from what?
From administration.
Oh, yeah.
And the countless things that kind of crash down on you. It's an escape. It's a way of leaving a world which is flawed in so many ways and going into another world that's also flawed, but maybe flawed in different ways at that time. You can escape the stresses of the 6 people lined up outside your door to ask you advice, and go read about Achilles, and read about the ancient Greeks or what have you. I think we'll break there. We'll go ahead and stop there for our lunch break. Let's try to get back at like 1:30 if we can. And then the goal will be to cover the Iliad this afternoon as best we can. And I know it's quite a task. We'll try to finish about 4:30, if that's all right. So the goal will be finishing about 4:30. We have one person who is watching this over live stream. I would love to pipe her in towards the end. So we'll maybe have a question and answer period, and we'll include her. I'll do it through a Zoom session. She can also introduce herself to you all at that time. She can ask some questions or make some comments. There will probably be 1 or 2 things that we've all missed that she'll have eagerly noted down and she can tell us all about. And then we'll be done for the day. Okay? So we'll come back at 1:30, go for about 3 hours to 4:30, and then we're done. Sound good? All right.